Hello, everyone. Welcome to our 9th season of EdTalks and our 3rd virtual EdTalks of the 2020-21 season. My name is Adia Morrison. I'm really excited to be the MC for tonight's event. I use she, her pronouns. We're coming to you virtually from many places, but Minneapolis, Minnesota, and St. Paul, Minnesota for two, also known as Minnesota Makoche. This is the homeland of the Dakota people. It's important for us to recognize that unless we're Indigenous Dakota, we're on stolen land taken through an unauthorized and illegitimate treaty in 1805. We recognize the acts of genocide committed against Native people, and perhaps most importantly, we acknowledge that Indigenous people are still here and present all around us. As we consume the important information presented in the talks this evening, I ask that you keep the troubled history of our state in your hearts and minds. I'm really excited to welcome two dynamic speakers to the EdTalks virtual stage, where they'll address how to model equity in education and mental health. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. I just want to take a moment to thank our generous sponsor, the Bush Foundation. We're so grateful for their long time and generous support of this program. Both talks have been pre-recorded for this event to make sure our technology works smoothly. However, our presenters are also online live with us to participate in a live Q&A at the end of the program. So speaking of which, if you have a question, use the Q&A button at any time through the presentations, but bear in mind the questions won't be addressed until the end. The event is scheduled to end at 8 p.m., but our speakers are willing to hang on a little bit longer if we need more time to get to more questions. We also encourage you to engage with social media during and after this event. So tweet, go on Facebook, Instagram, and you can use the hashtag EdTalksMinnesota. That's capital EDTALKS, capital M, capital N. This event is being recorded for our EdTalks video and audio libraries, which you will find by visiting the EdTalks webpage at achieveminneapolis.org/EdTalks. So let's get started. I am pleased to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Lanise Block. Lanise is a highly experienced educator who has served as a teacher, program coordinator, technology integration specialist, and strategic project administrator. She's currently an adjunct professor at various schools of education. Her research interests include the digital divide, advocacy, and inclusion. Lanise is also the founder of Sankore Consulting, which fosters creative leadership in organizations and builds capacity in equity, diversity, and innovation from the classroom to the boardroom. She holds a bachelor's degree from Drake University and master's and doctorate degrees in education from the University of St. Thomas. Thank you so much for being here, Lanise.
Have you ever planned a grand odyssey or not so great adventure? As you were conceptualizing your grand quest, it's likely you did many things to prepare. For instance, preparing your mind and body, then gathering the tools and accoutrements you need for your journey. You likely anticipated some of the hurdles on your journey and made preparations to overcome those obstacles. Lately, a grand odyssey can be something as simple as going to the grocery store, and for that, you'll need to remember to bring your mask. The journey to leadership can often feel like an adventure. It's certainly not easy. One lesson I try to teach my middle school-age sons is that a leader is someone who does what's right, even when others are doing wrong. And a follower just does what other people do. So when they have a conflict and want to respond in kind, I ask, are you a leader or a follower? That works about 50% of the time. The journey to be an equity-focused leader is even harder. The waters are more treacherous, the risk immense, the adversaries are more crafty. Because equity is about balancing the scales, mitigating centuries-old injustice, and addressing systematic shortfalls. What does equity look like? It looks like STEM labs for low-income schools instead of remedial strategies. Wi-Fi as a universal right instead of patchwork solutions to access, creating personalized learning for students functioning during a pandemic instead of penalties, spending dollars designated for BIPOC students on direct supports that address academic disparities. Many well-intentioned leaders have started on an equity journey only to be cut off at the pass. by the powers who be that want to maintain the status quo. However, in order to sustain the work, you need an equity identity. An identity is defined as the fact of being who or what a person is. An equity identity needs to be a part of who you are, your very fiber. An equity leader must be steeped and equipped with a clear foundation, like a tree planted by the water. Being an equity leader that projects true and authentic change takes a lot of courage, and you want to be ready. And so, the Developing the Equity Leadership Identity Framework, developed by Dr. Naomi Taylor and myself, will equip you on your journey. This framework identifies 5 critical lenses for equity leadership that offer a pathway for moving from personal development of identity toward a collective identity for leading for equity, diversity, and inclusion. Okay, developing an equity leadership framework includes critical cultural consciousness, understanding past inequities, understanding present inequities, cultural competence application, and finally, courageous equity-based decision making. Critical cultural consciousness, Foundations 101. Understand the basic tenets of implicit bias and developing cultural inclusiveness. Having this critical consciousness helps leaders understand the difference between all lives matter and Black lives matter. It helps avoid faux pas and missteps that destroy an equity leader's credibility. Critical understandings of inequities of the past. It is understanding the historic, systematic, and institutional injustices and oppression that have plagued our nation since its inception. For example, understanding the role the government played in enslaving African people and displacing indigenous nations. Once you begin to understand the inequities of the past, it helps bring into perspective the entrenched nature of oppression. Further, it clarifies how oppression took root and played out in dominant culture, policies and laws like the Anti-Literacy Law and the Indian Removal Act. Critical understanding of inequities present. This is a critical exploration that helps leaders understand how past inequities still have impact today. For instance, housing redlining, racial covenants leading to under-resourced urban centers. This prepares the equity leader to view with a critical eye injustice and its origin, understanding, for instance, that the lack of access and opportunities available and that the school to prison pipeline is by design. Critical cultural competence, focus, application. Creating the plan, starting the initiative, doing the work, committing to diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's where you align your mission to address equity issues, where you look for and implement innovative strategies to promote equity in your organization. It is inclusivity as the norm and not the outlier. From this stage, you move from talking the talk to walking the walk, from lofty ideas to concrete practices. Next, courageous, equity-based decision-making. In this stage, it focuses on redistribution of resources, changes in policies, practices, and procedures, really balancing the scales. This is where the rubber meets the road. This is the paragon of real, impactful, effective change, making equity work. This is where you move from being an equity speaker to an equity leader. However, prepare for resistance. Expect to play offense and defense when promoting equity. Now, your equity leadership identity is formed. Consider the following scenario. What would you do? Let's take, for example, Parker Olson. Parker is an associate superintendent at a school district that has moved through the stages of developing their equity leadership identity, and is now at the apex of making a courageous equity-based decision. Parker is faced with what will likely be an unpopular budgeting decision that will assuredly be misunderstood by dominant stakeholders and may even be met with reprisal. However, Parker knows this is the right, equitable choice to make, a choice that will help balance the resource scale, move toward correcting past wrongs, and bring about systematic change. If Parker was not prepared, undergirded, if Parker was lacking knowledge and insight and practice, if equity was not a part of Parker's identity, this is where the best intentions could lead to the worst results and Parker could fail. But with the equity leadership identity intact, Parker has the language, the historical context, the contemporary reference, the studied experience to be successful and maintain their integrity as an equity leader. Now, wow, don't worry, this doesn't all happen at once. Take into consideration these 4 steps in the equity leadership identity progressions. These steps will prepare leaders to take those critical steps to be brave. First step, centering. You are the agent of change. This is within your purview, your wheelhouse. To think about how can you activate your ecosystem for change with what is around you. Next phase, grounding. Self-assess, take cultural inventory. What are your core values about equity and inclusion? Where are the areas where you need to grow? Then moving to growing, where you use your influence to advocate, where you get out of your comfort zone and interrogate your previous learning. Lastly, leading. Prepare for resistance. Build equity-based accountability metrics so that you know when you are successful and where you need to make changes. Communicate equity as a priority. How are resources in your ecosystem under your purview being distributed to advance equity and inclusion? Whew, that was a lot. Want to know where to start? Let's go to the critical reflection model. This is the first step in the equity leadership journey. First step, consider the what of this experience. What did you hear? Next, the so what. What does it mean? How is it relevant to you? Lastly, the now what. What is the plan for your future? What will happen next? A quote from the Anti-Racist Alliance says, "Equity is the path from hope to change." I bid you Godspeed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lanise. I am excited by the steps that you laid out in that presentation. This is a reminder to everyone to submit your questions to the Q&A button as they come to you. We'll get to as many of them as we can at the end of the program. So next, we'll hear from Jamil Stamschror-Lott on where is mental health and equity, diversity, and inclusion work. Jamil Stamschror-Lott is a mental health professional who practices psychotherapy, hosts community healing sessions, and works with businesses to incorporate mental health, diversity, and inclusion through a therapeutic lens. Jamil and his wife, Sarah, are co-founders of Creative Kuponya, an organization that focuses on out-of-the-box, community-based, and creative methodologies to bring about healing for individuals, communities, and businesses. Jamil also teaches diversity and equity courses in Augsburg University's graduate social work program. He has been named a Mentor of the Year by New Lens Urban Mentoring and received Marquette University's Young Alumni of the Year Award in 2014. He holds a bachelor's degree in sociology from Marquette University and a master's degree in clinical social work from Augsburg University. Take it away, Jamil.
Featured in this photo, you'll see my grandfather and I in the late 80s working in his backyard and his garden that he had put in so much work for. You see, my grandfather lived in a tent for a year of his childhood with his parents as they would save enough to buy a house. Despite this obstacle and so many more, he would find himself at The Ohio State University as a student in the late 40s. He was one of 2 blacks allowed to play on the football team, an unwritten rule sanctioned by the conference. The poor treatment, as you could imagine, was so unbearable for him, he would eventually discontinue playing after his first year, leaving behind all that he had worked for in his hopes to become a dentist. He would sit in sadness and sorrow, wishing he had accomplished his goal for the remainder of his life until he passed in 2016. A year I'll never forget. He joined the military soon after, near the time of the Korean War. Afterward, he would return home, bringing back work ethic, the resiliency, and acquire skills, and implement that into his family, putting 5 Black beautiful children through college to attain both bachelor's degrees and a few master's degrees during the 70s. His work in the steel mill, he would invest his newly found skills and work ethic into, and also saving enough money to put a down payment on a home. However, regardless of all his accomplishments, being the first from his town in Ohio to play for the Buckeyes, he was denied the loan for the house to take care of his family, all because he was Black. He would need to use his sophistication, his creativity, and networking to find a former white football friend that respected his work ethic and admired how he had overcome so much. His friend told him, "Come all the way out, miles away. I know it's a lot, but I will approve you for this loan." You see, my grandfather's basic needs were only met when a white citizen approved. This was a systematic denial of an opportunity to purchase a home, to grow your wealth and security for your family's environment. What does that do to your mind, to your body, to your nervous system? How does that impact your sense of self-worth, self-control? How does this show in your family and in generations to come? My mother, featured here, in all her beauty, brilliance, and resilience, acquired a nursing degree in 4 years from Kent State University. She has now been practicing at the University of Minnesota Hospital for over 20 plus years. A task not easily accomplished after experiencing instructors in high school denying her the grades she earned because she was Black, telling other white students, "Don't associate with her because she's Black." Sitting in class as the only African-American student and hearing your instructor say, "Why don't they just send Blacks back to Africa?" A 14-year-old girl by herself. What do you do when your instructors are your bullies? How does this affect your mind, your body, and your nervous system, and your sense of safety and security in those moments, in moments to come? How does this show up for you and your family and for generations to come? My family would subsidize my education. If not for them, I would not learn in school how African Americans contributed to this country being the wealthiest country. In fact, they would not be the wealthiest country in this world today if not for them. Not only did I learn this resiliency building formally by sharing narratives, but also anytime we went to bed, we would say, "I love you." Anytime we departed shared spaces, "I love you." Being in a world that created the terms white, Black, in laws to increase the positive narratives and experiences of whites and the opposite for Blacks and other marginalized groups, I had to constantly fight not only white folks and others who believed they were superior to me. I had to internally battle with myself to not let the power of these experiences override what I learned and knew to be true, that I too am worthy, and my Black life matters too. However, this is a very, very difficult mission when you have other Black folks breaking under the most powerful nation's hatred in oppressive ways. Some Blacks would displace or project their oppression onto others that look like me or them, making comments such as, "You're too Black," and "Your lips are too big," and so on. You know the old adage though, hurt people, and I would add that trauma spreads like COVID-19. So subjected to the mistreatment by so many others and sitting in advanced placement classes in high school, looking around and seeing the same 2 Black folks and a sea of white students and Asian students, I too would eventually fall victim to the same negative notions, thinking, "How did that Black man get into that nice car? He must be a drug dealer." This is internalized oppression hate, anti-Blackness. We have all been conditioned to think like this to some degree. Along my working career, I decided to pursue my master's degree in clinical mental health. At the time, I was transitioning from doing restorative work in the juvenile lack of justice system and going into the school system, hoping to catch Black folks at an earlier age with the goals of intervening and disrupting this trauma and disparities. In both these spaces, I noticed that Black youth represented 80+% of those in detention centers and special educations. The irony. When applying to grad school, I asked my white, wealthy, liberal female friend to edit my personal statement. The only feedback I recall is her challenging my statement that there are very few African-American social workers in Minnesota. It wasn't until she did her own research to find some official numbers that I was actually correct. This not only fell into the microaggression realm, along with the your reality is not true. I'm superior to you and have the authority to validate your experience. What does that say to me about the way I'm experiencing the world? Am I crazy? Can I trust myself? Do I belong in this collegiate or professional institution? You see, these moments trigger all the past pains and traumas Black folks have endured for so many years. Wrestling with low self-esteem, imposter syndrome, negative implicit biases about Black folks, and so on. I would fight back this internalized hate, oppression, and anti-Blackness to complete my master's degree, only for those symptoms to reappear when it was time for me to prep for my licensing exam. In the summer of 2016, after much anxious studying, practicing calming techniques and prayer, I passed. After 4 long hours in a dark room, I exited the building into the warm summer sun, which matched my internal happiness, knowing that I had overcome the oppression, the hate, the imposter syndrome, only to have this moment quickly overshadowed by the horrific news that Philando Castile had been violently murdered, shot several times for doing nothing but driving with he and some loved ones. He worked in the same St. Paul public school system as me. He was brown and tall like me, driving in his car with his partner and a baby girl in the back like me. Once again, the statistical evaluation seems to match the systemic devaluation of this population. As time passed, there were more deaths brought to the attention of this nation in a similar fashion. This imagery flooded our mass media airways and social media streams. It didn't take long to realize that these moments not only overshadowed our achievements, but they struck a deeper chord, triggering the unhealed trauma of generations being systematically denied loans for their homes, for their businesses, denied the ability to protect yourself and your loved ones from harm. 2020, like 2016, would go down as another unforgettable year. Despite my new strategy to avoid the painful imagery of Black human bodies being mutilated by white bodies, Ahmaud Arbery, and police bodies, George Floyd, I, like many Americans, could not look away, had no choice in the matter. I was forced to witness the carnage. Our media streams care not as much about your well-being as their bottom line. You must protect yourself. So at this point, I mentioned trauma about 100 times. So what is it and how does it show up? Trauma is anything that happens too soon, too much, too fast, overwhelming the nervous system, which is designed to protect and predict threat and safety for your body. Another definition I find helpful is not so much the experience, but how you are impacted by the experience. In other words, anything leaving you feeling disconnected, devalued, powerless, and out of control is trauma, while producing traumatic effects such as shame, guilt, and self-hatred. Similar to that as my grandfather when he didn't graduate from school and become that dentist that he dreamed to be. Cognitive distortions, imposter syndrome, I'm not good enough to be here. Mental illness, drug and alcohol abuse. J. Cole said, and you wonder why we inhale already. Because we inhale already. So at Creative Kuponya, my wife and I's mental health agency, we had already been called on like no other to address mental health in these COVID times. However, once the world was inundated with these visuals of multiple police and other white folks killing unarmed black folks, the request became even greater, and my body was taxed like no other. What do you do as a mental health professional when your trauma is triggered and you're unable to process your pain? How do you offer quality service? How do working professionals do this in general, especially in high-stakes professions with high human interaction, with the potential to both contract and pass on unhealed trauma? Our schools, our legal profession, policing profession, corporate professions, and so on. What do you do? I'm going to leave you with two final takeaways and a special bonus. One, my mentality is anything but what these realities be. So I encountered a study stating that 50% of millennials and 75% of Gen Zers have left a job due to mental health related matters. 128 Americans take their lives by suicide a day, the highest rate in 50 years. Secondhand trauma is a very serious and real thing. If you are like me, you have seen teachers having crying spells in the classroom or in our hallways. You have seen them physically attack students on their worst days. This happens for other working professionals too. Dr. Rachel Uhata, professor of psychiatry and neuroscience, tells us environments and circumstances that produce trauma can be passed on genetically. So in other words, if we do not transform our trauma, we can transmit it, for better or for worse. She and other psychosocial professionals are finding data telling us a narrative of genes being altered to protect you. However, what happens when you're programmed to be hypervigilant, anxious, the Terminator, in an environment that calls for you to be relaxed? Leaving so many of us vulnerable to microaggressions, triggering past pain and sending us off into the deep end. It is important for our institutions, schools, nonprofits, businesses, and the like to cultivate environments that address the whole body being. Make conversations about mental health the norm, and if possible, have free, accessible therapy on site. And I'm talking about our teachers and working professionals. This is exactly what my wife and I did in our organization, Creative Kuponya, in our partnership with Allsquare, a Minneapolis restaurant named Time Magazine's 100 Greatest Places in the World in 2019. We have seen the retention rate improve for employees and their capacity to handle conflict grow as we provided mental health discussions and therapy in our integrated model. I must have a therapist as a therapist to be a healthy therapist. Finally, research shows that every dollar invested in mental health, diversity, and inclusion work, our orgs can have as much as a $19 return. That's an estimated 2,000% return on your investment. And we're not just talking dollars here. That's an investment on your well-being for yourself, your employees, and your business community. Second takeaway, hidden figures. I think of the figure I would be if these figures weren't hidden from me. We need to start telling the whole truth and nothing but the comprehensive truth. I recently had a Black African-born collegiate scholar tell me America is so self-centered. Other countries learn about other countries as well as their own. You all just learn about yourselves. I've heard of high schools banning discussions on Black Lives Matter and students and staff wearing Black Lives Matter attire, claiming it is political. Since when do we not discuss politics in our schools? Even though this was a very long time ago, I recall doing mock voting in elementary school. Walked into the little makeshift booth, checked Bill Clinton, got my little red sticker and rocked it for the rest of the day. Our schools are funded by politics. Our unions are embedded in politics. But isn't it interesting that when we discuss the Black experience, their reality is once again denied? You see, we can't keep omitting the all-inclusive truth. It doesn't just do Black folks a disservice to deny our realities and contributions to society, but it hurts us all. Take these two things into consideration. Big Bank City Group recently published a report stating that the past 20 years, the U.S. has lost $16 trillion due to racism, which only a few short years ago was our national debt. Think of the place we could be in right now. 2, the American Medical Association recently took ownership, saying 1, racism is alive and real till this day, and it is a threat to the public health for all U.S. citizens. Secondly, we have contributed to the harm being done to African Americans in all, and we vow to right our wrongs. When the comprehensive truth is not told, it imposes on our biases negatively. It impacts our well-being collectively. Without honoring the whole body narrative, it 1, leads to internalized shame and self-blame, similar to that of my grandfather, in not achieving his goals. It also causes others to victim blame. If you think being devalued and denied one's basic needs is not traumatic, and that you should just get over it, even if your genes haven't, you're adding to the harm of not just one group, but to yourself and the entire country. And now, for that bonus, a special note to Black folks. My ancestors passed on resiliency through stories of success, and by finding ways to address their trauma, and by undergoing traumatic experiences, epigenetics. No matter if you're in the streets or in the suites, you are here despite targeted efforts to oppress and or destroy you. These were of the greatest efforts in the world. Black folks, you are an incredible people, beautiful and brilliant, sexy and resilient, sophisticated, cultivated. Black humans, look at your accomplishments. There is nothing you cannot do, and I am proud of you.
Well, thank you, Jamil, and to both of our speakers for sharing your incredible insights and heartfelt truths. If you're in the audience, this is your chance for conversation with our EdTalks presenters through the Q&A. I'm going to welcome Dr. Lanise Block and Jamil Stamschror-Lott, and welcome them to the video. And if you're wondering where that Q&A button is, should be at the bottom of your window, and it's a button along with all those other commands at the bottom. So if you're wondering where to put your questions in. I know we have a few that came through. And so I want to go ahead and start with those. I also have a few questions of my own. Don't mind me throwing those in there. I believe this one is for Lanise. It says, how do you deploy tough, honest, equity-focused language without alienating key potential allies?
Thank you for that question. I would first like to say that it's a process. you don't start out with the necessary, the tough language at the onset. Sometimes it's as simple as, and starting with presenting the information, the data, the history, and then saying, what do we do about this? Forming it in questions, and really with the outcome, with the idea of the outcome is change and transformation. And so sometimes it's a process to moving people through the stages, kind of like the progression, through the process as they get new learning, understand it, get more, and you can keep pushing them further and further.
And I do have a follow-up question to that. In this era where folks have a resistance to data and the source of your data, how do you combat that? I mean, in an ideal world, we're dealing with folks who believe in science, but sometimes
Right.
they don't.
Right.
So I'm wondering, how do you get around that if you can?
So I was thinking, we have to think about largely leaders are leaders in a specific space. And so what is the data for your classroom, your school, your organization, your district? And really, that's hard to dispute that. And so looking at not only the numbers, but then also it's important to pair, and people often forget about this, qualitative data, understanding people's narratives. I'm particularly looking for understanding counter stories. Those kinds of things are also essential to building in relevance and buy-in from people who might otherwise not believe it.
Awesome. Thank you. We have another question, and I believe this one is for Jamil. It says, thank you all. My question, my organization gets kids excited about computer science, particularly kids who are often left out of comp sci, especially girls and BIPOC. We are working to expand our roster of BIPOC mentors of color, but want to ask, what do you think is most important for us to train our white mentors in to help them best work with students of color? And maybe it's for both of you. Maybe you both can answer.
Yeah, what just comes to mind in its immediacy is just growing an individual's capacity to handle differences. And so for working with young folks of color, there's a great chance that they have experienced some sort of trauma. I mean, just about everybody's experienced trauma, some type of form. However, when you're talking about marginalized groups of color in America, in the US, there's a greater chance that they're dealing with another form of trauma, which some would have the privilege of not having to experience. These are these other stressors that weigh on us. And so I think bringing insight into that, but also particularly if we're talking like young mentors, young folks who haven't had a lot of chance to really experience life outside of home, I think it's giving them the insight of like themselves. So the self-exploration. So understanding what makes you tick. What are your assumptions? Why do you think that way? So something that's going to give them some critical perspective of themselves and their analytical ability and perception of others, and how to interact with others that are coming from a different background. One thing I'll say, I recall working in juvenile probation and going into homes that I would see drugs on the table, going to homes, seeing weapons on the wall, and just having that moment of like, wow, like that reality is totally different. And so if I come up in an environment with a reality that's totally different than me, how guilty am I? And how is their perception of the world? And so then how do you work with someone that's coming from a different realm and having some sort of compassion and understanding? So I'm gonna pause there because that was quite a bit.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think you could keep going on, but I wanted to hear more. Lanise, did you have anything to add to that one?
Yeah, I think what Jamil said is just spot on. I would just add two things. One, that people often talk about building relationships with students, with young people, students, and I think it's important to note that the relationship has to be the catalyst for advocacy. There's no need for you to have a bunch of 14-year-old friends and then vice versa, right? The intention, the purpose, the function really of the relationship. I mean, it's important to establish a relationship, but the function of that relationship should be advocacy and change and leveraging that relationship for greater success, and we're leveraging that relationship for holding anyone or system accountable who might be trying to harm that child. So that's one thing. And then also really focusing on an asset-based mentality. So often we hear things and like Jamil talked about, is maybe seeing things in an environment we may feel like is bad and there's a deficit, but really thinking turning that around. Like, how do we think about this from an asset-based standpoint? Heard somebody say one time, we have to convince students, we have to understand that what they are bringing is as important as what we are giving, that any sort of learning is transactional, and that it needs to be something that is a balance between give and take. So I think those are critical elements that I would only add to the wonderful work that Jamil already talked about.
Excellent. Thank you both. Do you want to add more, Jamil?
Nope.
No. Okay. I heard an intake of breath. I wasn't sure. We had another question come in that says, Dr. Block, in education, we like to study, in quotes, issues and not take action. How do you recommend we get leaders to take action?
So I think it starts out with the end in mind. What are the specific outcomes? I think it's helpful to have framing documents. I'm like a framework type of person. I'm interested in that kind of thing. Things like making concrete changes, like policy, like your organization, is be it a school or an organization or a district, should have an equity policy, not an equity graphic, not an equity idea, but an equity policy, right? And then a framework or some sort of metrics based document that talks about who is responsible for what, when, how, and when are all these things going to be happening. So that helps, because I worked in education for many years. We do like to just admire things. So those types of tools, for instance, help move people from just thinking about and talking about it to really putting some things into action. And so because policy, practice, and procedure are the undergird the experiences that we all are having in whatever space, it's important to be a key sort of initial access point for really embedding and being starting to create authentic systems for equity in whatever system or organization you may be in.
Awesome. Did you want to add anything to that, Jamil, from another perspective?
No. Okay. No, I don't. I was thinking on a different wavelength. So
awesome. Well, I have a couple questions. In your presentation, Lanise, you mentioned that moving from personal identity to collective identity in that progression. I want to know more about that. Like, what does that collective, I mean, I have an answer, I'm sure, but what does that collective identity do for you or for your organization?
Right. So we're thinking oftentimes to really start any sort of competence or growth, you really have to situate yourself, like start with where you are in a space, like your identity, your basis, your autobiography. And then and that you kind of understand where are the areas you need to grow, where you need to change, what are the strengths, what are the benefits you bring to a space. And so once you have understand that, and that's clear to you, particularly in this case with your racial identity or cultural identity, then moving to a collective identity, you begin to understand that you are not the whole, but part of the whole. And you understand really your responsibility and what you're accountable to a system. I often talked when I was, in the classroom, that I was on the team of my students, right? And that was my intention, was to impact their lives. And so thinking about that collective sort of identity is how do you take yourself from the center, still being the actor of it, but really thinking about what is the greater good for everyone. And that helps in many cases give you the strength, the courage, the resolve to move equity work forward when there may be resistance. And so having that kind of collective idea that I'm responsible not only for myself and what's near me, but really for this whole body, for this whole work, that it is my responsibility to help move this forward is helpful. Was one way I would describe that.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Can't even read my notes. So this question is for Jamil, and maybe it's coming from me, but there might be others in the audience who have that same question. Keeping in mind those things that you mentioned at the end of your presentation, the special message for Black folks, but also in the face of those battles, those internal battles that we have, what are some practical things that someone can do when that stuff comes up, and that imposter syndrome and the internal conflict comes up and expresses itself? Are there ways that one can mentally attack that before it comes out in a negative way?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the question, which is part of the reason for my special message, because knowing that phenomenon so well, knowing that battle, it's important to recognize that like it's bigger than me and it's not just me. I don't need to just suffer in silence. There's a pattern here, and it's great. It's connected to higher structural forces at play. And so when you can realize and you can look back at the history, like the Sankofa, and then move forward, knowing that like it's not just about me, and also expressing in my narrative was just how we internalize it. So we internalize that pain, and then we turn on ourselves and others that look like us. So that's the defensive mechanism, projecting that onto other people that look like us, and not knowing that we need to heal that pain. And part of that process is recognizing those forces and then doing the work from there. I would say growing your capacity. And so understanding yourself, going into your body, we end up disconnecting ourselves from our body to try to continue to maintain. You have to keep going. But like an athlete, if you get an injury, for example, in February, I actually snapped my Achilles tendon. Yeah, it was horrific, especially with a toddler. But you can't just bounce back and jump up and start going. You have to honor that pain. It needs to be healed. You need to take your time and recognize it. And so that's what going on in our country today. We hear people jumping quickly, and I almost want to say using appropriated language, saying we need to heal. Let's just get over it. We need to heal. And that narrative is dangerous. You can't just heal and just jump and get over it. And those folks that experience that trauma, some of them are impacted in a way they have no idea, especially to continue to go on in the same place up until 3 o'clock in the morning and then come back and you're not connected with your loved ones. So you need to align yourself, understand yourself, but then align your circumstances to be conducive to your healing. So making sure that, like, say my mom died on this such and such date. Every time around in December, I need to make sure I have a supportive network here. I need to make sure I take off work here. I need to make sure my schedule has time for me to sleep. And I need to say it's okay for me to sleep. So these ongoing constant battles. And the last piece I'll say is just cognitive reframing. And so oftentimes we have been conditioned to work hard, take no days off, take pride in not taking days off. And coming into this new realm and understanding that we have to work in a way that is conducive to being in alignment with our bodies and honoring that we need to take care of ourselves. And it's okay to take a break to honor your well-being.
Excellent. Thank you. Things that I'm going to take in myself. The next question is, we heard a lot of personal stories. How important is it to do the personal work in order to connect to the collective?
It's critical. You don't know how you're entering into the space until you do you don't know what you might be having. And when I was in teacher preparation school many years ago, they talked about the classroom being neutral. And we heard Jamil talk about, and I've often came to understand that the classroom is not neutral. For instance, the spaces are not neutral. They're very politically charged. And so understanding where you are in the greater things of this historically, contemporarily, and what the identities you bring into the space and how they might impact, how you might see, how you might react, how you might be experiencing whatever is happening. It's the critical first step, because otherwise you go in and you don't know what you're bringing into the space, where it could be doing a much more harm. So that's a critical first step to doing any sort of organizational change or strategic work. You first start with establishing the baseline, right? And that's kind of what I would equate that to, is really understanding who you are first, and then starting to interrogate the space that you might be in and cause change.
Excellent.
So I would add that it's critical. So as a mentor and working specifically in an agency that is mentoring Black men, so it's Black men mentoring Black men, again, knowing that there's a lot of trauma there, you have to be able to do the healing, which is like maintenance. You have to consistently do it. So I need to consistently see a therapist, even when I'm feeling good. And oftentimes we feel like when we're feeling good, that's, oh, I'm good, I don't have to worry about it. Then all of a sudden it creeps back up. And so it's important to consistently, just like I need to consistently shave, need to consistently eat. There's certain things that you have to do regularly. Clean your house, especially with a toddler. You have to consistently do the healing work. And that's important because when working with young folks who have other things coming up, if you haven't done the healing work, they can trigger all sorts of things for you, things from your childhood, and then you snap out or lash out on them, or you just become disconnected. Oftentimes I would see other Black mentors start to just fall off. And there hasn't been like a discourse or sort of a training or sort of a cultural cultivating of like, how do we exist in harmony together, despite when this little guy says something that's just really disrespectful, even though they didn't mean it, maybe they were anxious in a moment and they said something that was just really out of line or out of pocket, and then you lose it or you just disengage. And so really it's important to do that healing work so that you can handle those blows. And I thought of black tax in many different ways, but one thing I used to think of black tax is like, I can take some of that heat. I have the capacity, I've done the healing. And so I can take some of that heat when they're having a tough moment, when they lash out on me. And I realize it's not about me, it's greater forces at large. And that's a sign of that you're in a healing state of mind, as opposed to responsive or, reactive state.
Excellent. I feel like I'm kind of taking it in myself. That's why sometimes I look a little like, poof, like something just came over me. What tips do you have as we work with elementary age young people around these topics?
Yeah.
It could be for either of you.
Dr. Block, I feel like I'm taking a lot of.
No, go ahead. I think that's
Okay.
for you to talk about, like mental health and things like that. I'm curious what you have to say too, Jamil.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, young folks especially just really learning how to, first of all, as adults, we need to learn how to be in our bodies and exist and heal and do our work. You know what I mean? And that's why I think it's critical that we have mental health folks on staff for our teachers and other working professionals, because they don't even have the resources. Thinking of our history, we're maybe in a similar age range. I think of the history, there was no context for mental health, nothing. You better get over it, you better get to work. And if you don't, then we're gonna bash you in various different ways. And so if you don't have that script, then how do you work with young folks when they're going through so much? And I'm coming from a context of working in the Twin Cities. I was a student and staff member in the Minneapolis and St. Paul public school districts. And so it's a different dynamic. And so you have to learn how to do the healing for yourselves. And so I'm just thinking of breathing techniques. They say meditation is far more powerful than psychotropic medications. Just learning how to be in your body, noticing when sensations come, what does that mean? If you're anxious, what do you need to do? Like, we need courses on that. Just how do you, we're chasing so much, but we don't even know how to take care of our well-being.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And speaking of that, going back to that point where you mentioned that there wasn't anything growing up, there were no mental health resources in schools for students. I do wonder, is there resistance now when bringing up mental health topics in an education setting, or are most people mostly on board? And if there is resistance, like, again, how do you bringing back that expect resistance, how do you combat that?
Yeah, this is why I love our younger generation, because they're so open to so much. I know for me, it's still a spectrum. There's generational stuff. There's global stuff. I know in one school I worked in the St. Paul Public School District, you could walk into any class and there's at least 5 to 7 different countries represented in that space. And so I worked with, Asian families there's a lot of families globally that still don't have a script or don't have any sort of nothing for mental health. And so I've had the privilege to work with families where they're like, we don't believe in this stuff, but you saved my daughter from taking her life. So do whatever you got to keep doing. We'll sign off on whatever. I kind of lost track on the original question you asked.
No, it was just, if there's resistance to it, like how does one combat that if you're bringing that up?
Yeah,
saying, we have a need for this.
Yeah, and going along with that, so that last example I just provided, I think there's some resistance, but I'm noticing there's a wave, there's a shift. I think we're all seeing it. I work with some, there's a lot of professional institutions working with the Vikings. I'm seeing a lot of private practice where they're all talking about mental health and they're all working with therapists. And then, like I said, at the end of the day, if you're saving your, somebody's baby's life, then they're like, I don't care. If just as long as you take care of my baby, I'm for it.
Excellent. We had a few questions come through the Q&A, so let's jump on those. I'll throw this one to Dr. Block. As a white male that generally feels very aware of how unfair, unjust, and clearly racially biased things are, what can I do to show my students and student athletes that I am aware, that I want to be an ally, and that I want to help change things for the better?
I think it's the same thing I've mentioned before about what is the function of that relationship. Are you willing to be are you willing to
to advocate for the students. I recently, during the Kwanzaa season, we have, where my family and I, we watch African-American focused documentaries. So my sons chose to watch 42, with one movie about Jackie Robinson and the guy, I forgot his name, but he's played by Harrison Ford. And so I was watching that, I really was thinking that this guy was a true ally. He was doing lots of the things to help, the Jackie Robinson character. He, supported him and reaffirmed that what he was experiencing was true and it was awful. But also, thought about how to get him to respond in a way that was productive and helpful. But then what was most important to me in that particular example was that he held his white colleagues accountable. He told them, this is what we're going to be doing. This is how it's going to be happening. And I'm standing by this decision. I'm defending this particular, this young man. He has a right to be here. And even if it risks our relationship, our friendship, I'm willing to stand by my beliefs and the intention and contract and promise I made with this young man. And that showed, and that example, some of his friends, some of his colleagues did eventually come around, and some of them weren't friends anymore. So how do we, as if you are interested in being an ally, how do you use that allyship for change? How are you holding the people around you accountable to making life better for those young people those student athletes that you are engaged with? What are you doing specifically in addressing how they're treated, what they're experiencing, to make a difference in their lives? Just being friends to them is of no consequence if it's not functioning to be an ally and advocate in real systemic and impactful ways to make a difference in their lives. And sometimes it is holding people around you accountable. Sometimes it is getting uncomfortable. Sometimes it is challenging the system, even at risk to your own well-being, not necessarily well-being, but definitely your own livelihood for sure. Mm-hmm. So those were things that I would definitely suggest.
Excellent, thank you.
So I would just add, just being your true authentic self. And this is a good example of your earlier question of like, how do we work with young folks and teaching them with a mental health related sort of matters and how to be in your body. And so I think, one, we have to pause. We're so quick with everything. This is one of the biggest pieces I've learned with mental health. We are so like way over here when we need to come back and bring it here. And it's okay to come back. And so ultimately, you can say to your class, I'm feeling anxious about this matter. I feel it in my body. I get sweaty, recognizing all these symptoms that come up, these things that we tend to ignore. What do you feel, class? Like, we go deep with it. Like, and then how do we proceed? And so I notice a lot of folks want to avoid, especially in our Minnesotan culture. I know it to be Minnesotan. I'm sure it's national. I hear the East Coast is more honest, but we tend to avoid these subject matters and we need to go there. And I feel like this is where I would have been awakened in my class. If you were to talk about the history and the context of like the terror and the things that have happened to us and the things that have been taken away, I feel like we were given this whitewashed sort of narrative that will put you to sleep. It was like very Mother Goosey. But if you had given me the real gritty details, I would have woken up. And that's what happened in college. That's why I did sociology, because I was like, they're speaking to the social fabric, the symptoms of what I experience every day. And then the other classes aren't really doing that for me. And so I'm going to go this route for that very reason.
Excellent. Thank you. We had another question that wasn't really a question, more of a statement. It says, thank you very much. Really appreciate hearing the response to that question. Thank you both. We have a couple more that popped up. Hi, everyone. Thank you for making this event happen. Appreciate you both, Dr. Block and Mr. Jamil. Being from Minneapolis, there are many unique challenges for people of color and especially for Black families. Can you provide examples of where you believe we should prioritize our efforts to help address some of our unique challenges?
I would say we have to start out with the school systems that are our students, our BIPOC students are experiencing, particularly our Black students are experiencing the greatest disparities and academic disparities, experiencing far less success than those, and then discipline disparities that they're experiencing way too much of. And so addressing some of those policies relating to access and opportunities for African-American children, I think is a particularly, we're talking about children and families, I think that's a critical place to begin the work, to trying to make those changes, those substantive systemic changes that are necessary to change the trajectory of their lives.
Yeah.
So I would add that you got to find a network to charge your batteries. And so sometimes you don't realize how your environment or those relationships you're around are draining your batteries, depleting you. And it wasn't in certain moments that I have, such as like I work with Dr. Omari, Jason Soul, and with a bunch of African-American scholars. And even with the New Lens Urban Mentoring, when it existed, it was a lot of Black mentors coming together and Black young folks. And it just gave you so much energy. Like I didn't realize how burnt out I was or how much I was depleted until we came together. And there was like this, oh, okay, Black folks can be computer scientists, Black folks can be in the school system. And it was like, you've seen all this and you could feel the positivity, and I felt like I could go on for a few more months. And so I think it's critical for anybody to kind of find that environment that is honoring, again, your authenticity, your humanity, and all components of it. Because oftentimes we exist in spaces where we feel like we're often trying to fight and put up this facade of who I am, but not really honoring the other needs. And so your needs are getting neglected, and you're not getting the nurturing that you need.
Excellent. I think it is 8 o'clock, so I want to say we're not going to end yet. We're going to address this question that we've got in the queue. But if anybody does need to go, thank you for being with us tonight, and we understand. Our students' families are experiencing an overwhelming amount of trauma. We lost several students to gun violence since June. One family lost 2 of her sons. As a clinician, how can we support our students when they're operating in survival mode and don't believe school is a priority or even worth their time?
Yeah, so I was,
Yeah.
that's all right. Thank you. No, I would say, take it to where they are. Like bring it there. Like what is going on in their environments? And some of our instructors are so disconnected because they don't live in this environment. You know what I mean? Like I've worked with folks that I love. I love these instructors. I don't wish them any harm, or I understand what's going on. But like, if you like drive out to Anoka, Bloomington, Lakeville every day, and you come all the way into St. Paul Public School District or Minneapolis School District, and you make no effort, valid or invalid or whatever, warranted or not, you make no effort to go to their games in their environment, their talent competitions or whatever they got going on. You don't see them in a different light. You just see them in one realm. And so it's important to like get into those different environments. And so that being said, you got to be able to know what's going on in their environments too. So if you're in there, like there's gun violence going on. I knew, like some of my clients told me, one from North Minneapolis, he was like, I'm caught up in it. And we're going back and forth. And my mom doesn't know that one of my good friends was shot and murdered right in front of me. I haven't told her it happened 2 years ago. And we're trying to come at the police, like we're in this point, everybody's mad and we're trying to catch the police slipping so we can get them. And so if you're not really in the environment, if you go into this sanitized school system and then that's the only place you see them and you leave, you don't really know what's going on. So you need to know, and then you put it on the table. I hear this, let's pause everybody. How's your bodies doing? What's going on? I hear there's a lot of gun violence, and how are you impacted? Oh, my cousin Tony, he did something happen. Oh, okay. And so, but some of us are so afraid to go there because we don't have the script. I'm scared if I say anything about suicide, then other people are going to start doing suicide. We don't even understand like the basics of 101 of mental health. And so oftentimes we get our support staff getting taxed because they're like, oh my God, Jimmy is scratching on his arm with an eraser. Can you get in here? And they disrupt the session with the social worker, and then the social worker's running in there and they're like, that's not really a big issue. You can just talk to them. It's okay. Well, you're the professional and I don't want nothing to do with it. And so it's really have to get into it if you really want to be there. But some of us don't have the capacity to get there. And I think our ecosystems, our structures of our school system needs to make the capacity for us to cultivate the culture for us to go there.
Yeah. I hear a lot in both of these questions is the willingness to be uncomfortable. In both these responses I hear in almost all these questions, it's like just a willingness to step out of our comfort zone and do maybe more than we've done in the past, and to let that fear be there and then just move past it. And would you say that that's true?
I would say there's an element of that, and there's also like building the capacity to handle it. So that might mean you need to go to therapy to like deal with your own stuff, because you're trying to, sometimes we shut down. I don't want to see it. I don't want to hear it. I just want to disconnect. And so we need to have the ability to go there. And sometimes that's why I said in my presentation, the trauma can be passed on. Like it's like a contagion. We can pass it on. And so we might get too much. Sometimes we are having too many students bringing too much to us, and we have no support system in this environment to really handle it. So it's not all on the instructor or your professional. That's why I said the environment needs to also equip you with those resources, knowing that this is our population. We're in a business of relationships. And so we need to have some tools to handle that. I've been taught to teach math. I didn't not to deal with all this.
Yeah. There was a follow-up that says, thank you, but I've been to their homes and they're still not buying it. So I don't know that there's an answer to that question. If you have some insight, then that's awesome. If you want to share that, if you don't, I understand.
Thank you, but I've been to their homes and they're still it's a mentality too, and that's where I say you got to grow your capacity. I'm just going to be real. Like when I hear that language, it makes me cringe a bit. I don't wish I'm not, it just does, because I've heard that. It's like, I tried it and it's done. But yet we expect our students to like, don't give up, keep going, you got it. Like we put so much on others, particularly our young folks, our more vulnerable population. And then when we just sometimes just, I tried it, see, I told you. And it confirms my biases, or it confirms what I already knew to be true and my assumptions. And that's why I say, like, you got to grow the capacity to handle it. You got to know it's not going to be easy.
Thank you. Well, I want to make sure that we wrap in time for everybody to for everybody to end on time, or close to on time. So I just want to say thank you everyone for the great questions, and thank you so much to Dr. Lanise Block and Jamil Stamschror-Lott. I hope that everyone feels as encouraged and challenged as I do in this moment, and I'm really appreciative of all that you've shared with us today. So everyone in the audience, thank you. I navigated away to my script, so I didn't see that you were speaking, but thank you. For everyone, please mark your calendars for our next Ed Talks on Monday, February 8th. Registration's already open for the event, and we hope you'll join us to hear from Dr. Courtney Bell and Derek Francis, who will speak to the importance of addressing culture and race inside and outside of the classroom. You can find more information about this and other events at achieveminneapolis.org/events. Also, keep an eye on your email for tonight's video recording, great resources suggested by tonight's presenters, and information on future events. Thank you again to our generous founder, the Bush Foundation. They make Ed Talks possible. And if you'd like to connect with our event co-sponsors, Achieve Minneapolis and the Citizens League, you can find their website information on the screen. Check them out to learn about their great work in our community and ways you can get engaged. Thank you all for joining us, our presenters and our audience. Good night, everyone, and take care.